All right, let's start with the piping bags. Now, these are disposable, and I don't know what brand these are, but that's what's on the label. And then these are larger. You can get smaller bags. Most of the bags that you get that are disposable are smaller than this, but these are pretty big. You have to be careful not to overfill a bag because then it gets hard to handle. This is the coupler, and this is the tip coupler that lets you change the piping tips without having to take it out of the bag, and it just makes it a lot easier to use the same icing without having to get all greasy and disgusting because you're taking things in and out of the bags. So put it all the way down into the tip of the bag and kind of look to see where the tip ends there. And you want to cut it kind of even with it. You don't want it to be shorter than the white part of the coupler. And see, this is a little bit longer, and that's fine. You want it to be like that because then it'll hold the tip in place. And when you screw this on, everything's going to fit. So here's the first tip. We are using a piping tip that is for petals. So you can make flowers with this. You can make ruffles with this. They're different sizes of these. They all have the wider. They look they look like a little. I don't even know what it looks like, but it's narrow on one end. It's round on the other, and it's for making roses. Basically, it's a piping tip for flowers. But like I said, you can do other stuff with it. So put it on the coupler. Screw that holder on, and then what you're going to do is put the now, I will say sometimes it's hard to screw that thing on, so just be careful with that because you don't want it to explode. If you're filling the bag, use a drinking glass like this if you're not sure what you're doing, if because it's just easier, you don't have to hold the bag, and you can use the side of the cup to scrape the icing like that. Really try to force it down into the tip of the bag because you're going to have to try to get the air out, and it's easier if there's not a whole lot of air in it. And then this is how I do it. If you don't want to use the cup, I'm just switching over to show you how this way. You can use your hand, and this is a little, if you're used to piping, this is fine. But if you're not, use the cup because it just leaves you with both hands free. All right, so now when you get the bag out, it's going to have air in the tip like that. You're going to grab one side of the icing and push it down so that you're forcing the icing down one side, and then any air can go up the other side. You don't want to just force it. See, it goes down here and then up here. You don't want to just force it down like completely from the top because then that air is not going to have anywhere to go. So try to do that and then force it down once the tip is full and twist it. And this is how you hold the bag. This is really important. This bag is a little full because the bag, like the piping bag, was really big. But when you hold it, you put it in the palm of your hand and you squeeze it with your fingers against the heel of your palm, right? You don't see, put the twisty part in between your thumb and first finger and kind of pinch it. But when you're squeezing the bag, you should be squeezing it from the top here, not from the middle. And keep that in between your fingers to keep it tight. Hold it like that, and you're going to squeeze your fingers against your palm, and that's how you squeeze the icing. Do not grab it like this in the middle because then it will all ooze up through the top and explode out, and you're going to have a mess. Okay, so that's how you hold the bag. And like I said, this is a little too full. I should have left it a little emptier. Like it should be about maybe 2/3 of that because if you have too much icing in the bag, it gets difficult to manage and harder to squeeze out. So what you're going to do now, take a plastic cutting board and just practice. And this is the kind of thing where if you use practice icing, which would be the air dry buttercream icing, and I can put a link to that in the description of this video, you're going to have a lot of ways you can practice with that because there's nothing dairy in it. It's Crisco confectioner sugar and water. You can use this icing over and over to practice and just scrape it off the board and put it back in the tub and keep going. So practicing is really important if you've never done any piping before because you really have to get the feel of the motion of squeezing and moving the bag and the whole thing. This is a piping nail. This is a flower nail. And if you're doing flowers, excuse me, if you're doing flowers, put the little wax paper or parchment paper on with a little bit of icing and then just practice the flowers like this. These are the air dry buttercream flowers. And like I said, I do have an article about that. So I'll put the link to it and you can read more about that. But you can make these ahead of time. If this is the practice icing, it's air dry buttercream. There's no butter in it at all. It will dry out. And see, then when you're done, you can scrape this up, just put it back in the tub, and you can reuse it. So make one batch of practice buttercream, and then you can practice with that all you want. You don't have to waste icing. And the next tip that we're using is the number 32, I believe. This is a star tip, and to switch this is why you use a coupler. Unscrew the top. This will come out. You have to kind of press. Sometimes it gets stuck, so you have to press it out. But then all you have to do is switch the tip onto the coupler and screw this back on. Now, eventually the bag will start to rip because if the coupler screw part is rough, it will try to rip it. But this is going to let you use the same bag of icing multiple times without having to change it. And it's just a lot more convenient that way. And especially if you're practicing with different tips and you're using the same color. Obviously, you have different colors, you're going to have different bags of icing. But okay, now when you're squeezing the tip, what you're going to do is squeeze and then stop squeezing and pull it. And you're going to have to get that motion of and learn kind of when to stop squeezing. So you start by squeezing it and then you stop squeezing and pull it, and that makes that tip. So just go in and practice this. Piping is really just getting the hang of when to move the bag and when to hold the bag still. And like if you're holding it at a straight up and down angle like this, you're going to get a different look. So go in and just play around because a lot of people have techniques that are very standard, but you can go in and figure some things out to do that are interesting. It really is just a matter of figuring out the rhythm of how fast to go and what to do. And then if you're covering cupcakes, that's what you do. That's all it is. And you can use a different tip that has wider ridges to get those really deep cupcake ridges. But this is all you have. This is all they do when they're covering cupcakes. That's it. Okay. And so the larger tips, there are extra large tips that have really deep ridges that'll give you that dark, deep cupcake look. You know what I'm talking about. But you can take any tip really. I mean, you don't need to use one of these. And just go in and decorate cupcakes like flowers. You can put little, like this is, I don't even know what I'm doing here. I'm just putting little ridgy bumps on it, and then it gives you kind of a different look. So there's all kinds of different things you can do. Go in and practice, have fun, and like I said, this icing, you can just scrape it off the little cutting board. And you can get these cutting boards at the dollar store. They're those flexible plastic cutting boards, or you could use a piece of cardboard with some wax paper on it if you don't have a cutting board. There's lots of things. Okay, now when we get to the cake, we're going to mark the cake because this type of cake has like the loops at the top, kind of the drapes, and you want it to be even. So just take a skewer, mark two, and this is a 6-inch cake, so it's small. So if you have an 8-inch cake, you're going to do more probably, but just mark straight across and then just go in and just eyeball it, just mark it with the skewer. And if you want to, I mean, they do sell like cake markers. You don't really need to use that unless you're really, really bad at marking stuff. But just go in. Oh, I'm sorry about the focus on this, but just follow the line. Yeah, the camera's kind of going in and out of focus depending on what's in the front. Just follow the line and start piping and think about it beforehand because I did this, I did this cake like 3 times because I would do it and then go, I don't know. So think about what you want it to look like, but I used only 2 tips for this whole cake. So it's the same ones that I was practicing with. And you don't need a whole lot of different tips, which is the benefit of trying to stick with just 2, but you do need to kind of know what you're going to do beforehand. And I really probably should have done the vertical stuff that I'm going to show you in a minute before I did those drapes, just to make it a little bit easier on myself. You usually do this border at the top kind of last, but it depends on what else you're going to do. And this kind of cake that people are doing now, they're calling it rococo, they're calling it Victorian, they're calling it vintage. I've seen people call it Lambeth, which isn't exactly right because Lambeth is a very specific technique. The idea is that there's just a lot of fancy buttercream piping, but this is a lot of buttercream. And when I was redoing this cake because I didn't like the way it looked the first time, I was scraping a lot of buttercream off. All right. So just kind of have an idea of what you're going to do first. Or you could just go in. I was just kind of looking at it and going, what should I do now? So you don't have to have a plan. But if you do have a plan, it helps because I had to take the tip off and switch back and forth a couple of times. And it would have been good to know when I was going to do that. Maybe I would have used 2 different piping bags, make it a little faster. Just have a plan. Try to have a plan. But if you're just going to go in and have fun, then it's fine. And if you don't like it, just de-ice the cake and start over. It's not a big deal. But this is a lot of icing. So just be aware of that when you're serving it. Some people might be super psyched about that. But see, so far I've only used the shell tip, which is really good for these kinds of borders and stuff. But like I said, it's a lot of icing. You also can get smaller shell tips. So this kind of a cake is, like I said, people call it different things. It's really just kind of a retro style cake. I mean, this is what my parents' wedding cake looked like. They got married in the early 60s. So like in the 50s and the 60s, this is what wedding cakes look like. It's not really a specific era, but people are calling it rococo now, so that's fine. So now I've switched to the or to the petal tip, and I'm going to go in here and just pipe a little ridge on top to give it a little ruffle look. And you can use a flat tip. There's flat piping tips that you use to do basket weave. You can use one of those for this also. I've seen people do a lot of designs with flat tips and a shell tip on this type of cake. And that's really all you need. The two tips are going to give you enough of a different look with the shapes of the piped icing that you don't need to worry about doing too many different tips. And just keeping it to one or two kind of gives it a consistency. I mean, this is just a really roughly looking cake. So the petal tip gives you a good ruffle with that edge. And when you're piping with this, you want the skinny part, like the narrow part of the tip, to be up. And again, I apologize for the focus. That's the camera going in and out of focus, but you'll be able to see it when it's done. But I'm just adding a little ruffle on top of each of these shell rows. And then I'm going to do another one up at the top, because another kind of quality of this style of cake is that they seem to have a lot on the top of the cake, like a lot of heavy piping on the top of the cake, with maybe a section in the center that's empty. I've seen people go in there with a round tip, which is not something that I'm using here, and just do a little decorative piping like vining and stuff like that. So you could do that. But see here, I'm adding a ruffle on top of the shell on that top border. So it's going to give it a layered look when you look at it from the top. And I do have a picture at the very end that I'll show you. And you could go into the middle of that, put some flowers. You could add a message if it's a birthday cake. You could do happy birthday on it. There's any number of things that you can do. You need to be careful though, because once you get to this point, if you add something to it that you don't like, it gets harder to remove it without having to redo the whole thing. You know, like I literally did redo this cake, I think twice, because I didn't like it. And I'm like, ah, that's too much. But I couldn't really take things off without, you know, completely wrecking it. Okay, so now I've changed the tip. I've edited this. I did change the tip, and I'm going back in and I'm adding a third border on the inside, which does seem to be, like I said, a feature of this type of cake, is that there's kind of layers of borders with different shapes. So you can experiment with the flat tip, make a little ruffle, just make a flat band. I've seen people just do a flat, like a swag that's flat. And I would see, now you can see the side, you can see the top, but I do have a picture coming up where you're going to be able to see the whole thing. And it's a cute cake. It's a lot of icing. It's very vintage, it's very retro, but it is a nice look and it's popular right now. So go have some fun. Try it out.